cut out now.
Just like to say Jumbo to everybody watching, and welcome again to another session from the Pan-African Congress movement. This week being the first Sunday, we'll be having Elder Cecil Gutzmore, who will be speaking on the topic today of British racism and the various icons that comes with it too. But before we do that, we'll start off as usual by giving homage to our ancestors. And I'd like to do that by calling up on Brother Imani, who would be doing a libation. So I'll go back in the room and
Asante Sana Ndugu Tahaka and Hamjambo kindred, which means greetings kindred. And so welcome again to the Emoji session on PACMTV. And my name is Ndugu Imani. Ndugu just means brother in Kiswahili. And I'm going to go through a ritual that I've created for us in virtual space so that we can change the energy, and so that no matter where we are, we can be in accord through spirit and give thanks to the all, to the ancestors, and to the cosmic principles and forces. But before I do so, I need to ask MZ Cecil, Elder Cecil, if I may proceed.
Please proceed, my brother.
Okay, Asante Sana. Thank you very much, Elder. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. So this ritual is called Mabadili Koyal Nishati, which is change of energy. And so things are going to be in English and in Kiswahili, but you'll be able to follow it on screen. With African spirituality, it's not about coercion. So wherever you are, if you wish to participate, please do. But if you don't, you just want to watch, then that's absolutely fine. So you'll be able to follow, and you'll be able to understand what's going on by the presentation. Okay. So in order for us to start, then first of all, that we need to get ourselves in the right frame of mind and using our breath. It's very important because our breath is our connection between the material world, the physical world, and the spiritual world. And so to do that, we're going to breathe deeply. So if you are wherever you may be across the world, if you are sitting straight and with your hands on your thighs and your feet flat on the floor, we're going to close our eyes and we're going to breathe deeply. And how we're going to do that, we're going to make sure we're breathing with our diaphragm. And we'll breathe in unison on our count 4 times, because 4 is the spiritual number for growth and health and for foundation, which is what we're trying to do, build a foundation for our race, our families, our nation, our communities. So, closing our eyes first, if we breathe out and pull our stomach in as we breathe out. Relax and breathe in for the nose. That's 1, or moja. Breathe out, put the stomach in. Relax the stomach and breathe in for the nose. Feeling the air coming in and ourselves becoming calmer and more centered. We breathe out. And breathe in by relaxing the stomach. Tatu. And breathe out again, put it in the stomach. And relax. And breathe in. Beautiful. So now you can open your eyes. And I take this triangle chime and I'm going to play it 7 times. 7 is the spiritual number for wisdom, seeking, and truth. And 7 is a very strong spiritual number. We see it through nature and existence, 7 days of the week, 7 colors in the spectrum, 7 major notes in the musical scale, 7 openings to the body, 7 layers to the skin, 7 laws of Tahuti, 7 deadly sins, and so on and so forth. So I begin. To change the energy or vibration, we now thank the powers to ask that we have a closer connection with them and they assist us in manifesting our objectives. 7 deadly sins, and so on and so forth. So now, as I ring the chime, let the vibration go around you, over you, and through you. Bring you in accord with the energies wherever you may be. Opening up your consciousness to the all, universal consciousness. And by doing so, connect with each other through spirit, as we are all energy of the one singularity, the all, the one vibration. Moja. Mbili. Continue to breathe deeply. Tatu. In there. Tano. Sita. Saba. And now we come onto the calling onto those powers into our presence, and it's call and response. And so I say the first, and then we say in unison, we are the one, or we are the same thing, which in Kiswahili is Sisi ni kitu kimoja. So I begin. Ninaomba ya muumba awote.
Sisi
ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba ya nebacha. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya mamlaka.
Sisi ni kitu
kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya shu. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya tefnut. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya nut. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya geb. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya auset. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya sebek. Sisini
Sisini
Kitu
Kitu
Kimoja.
Kimoja.
Ninamba Kanunina Nguvu Ya Hetaru. Sisini Kitu
Kitu
Kimoja.
Kimoja.
Ninamba Kanunina Nguvu Ya Haru. Sisini
Sisini
Kitu
Kitu
Kimoja.
Kimoja.
Ninamba Kanunina Nguvu Ya Haraputi. Sisini
Sisini Kitu Kimoja.
Ninamba Kanunina Nguvu Ya Maat.
Sisini
Kitu
Kitu
Kimoja.
Kimoja.
Ninamba Kanunina Nguvu Ya Saka. Sisini Kitu
Kitu
Kimoja.
Kimoja.
Ninamba Kanunina Nguvu Ya Tahuti. Sisini Kitu Kimoja.
Kimoja.
Ninamba Kanunina Nguvu Ya Asa. Sisini Kitu Kimoja. Ninamba Kanunina Nguvu Ya Amen. Sisini Kitu Kimoja. And now we can call upon those ancestors that are in our direct bloodline. Ninamba Babu Egerton Reed. Sisini Kitu Kimoja.
Nina Umba Iceland Ratigan.
Sisini Kitu Kimoja. And now we can go on to those ancestors who are not in our direct bloodline, but have made a tremendous contribution to our communities, to our nations, to our race. If it's in our divine purpose, we'll be able to emulate their works and even go beyond them. Inaomba Mzee the Honorable Marcus Mazar Garvey. Sisini
Kita Kimoja. Nina Umba Ya Santua.
Sisini Kitu Kimoja. Ninaomba Mzee Dr. Francis Cresswellson. Sisini Kitu Kimoja.
Nina Umba Sheikh Amadou Bamba.
Sisini Kitu
Kimoja.
Ninaomba Mzee Thomas Sankara. Sisini Kitu
Kimoja. Nina Umba Kimpavita.
Sisini Kitu Kimoja. Ninaomba Mzee El Haj Malik Shabazz. Sisini Kitu Kimoja. Okay. Ninaomba Betty Shabazz. Sisini Kitu Kimoja. Ninaomba Mzee Nana Bonsu. Sisini Kitu Kimoja. Now we can call upon those ancestors, group of ancestors that we should never forget who have given us a tremendous legacy to follow. First of all, those we should never forget, those who died in Arabic enslavement, European enslavement, colonialism and neo-colonialism. Ninaomba mababu ya maangamizi. Sisi ni kitu
kimoja.
Ninaomba mababu ya Asian Revolution. Sisi ni
kitu kimoja.
Ninaomba mababu ya APLA. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba mababu ya Kemet. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba mababu ya Kaseti. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. And the first people on the face of the earth, ninaomba mababu ya Twana Hutu. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninawaomba wananchi ambao watatetea sisi na wale mababu ambao bado hawajazaliwa. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. And finally, we end on the words of power and affirmation. Nguvu zote kwa watu wetu, na mapenzi ya wote ni mapenzi yetu.
Okay,
Asante sana.
Asante sana. So I'd like to say asante sana to Brother Ndugu Imani for doing us the pleasure of doing a libation for us. So now I'd like to hand over to Elder Cecil. And Elder Cecil, today we'll be looking at, I'll put it up on the screen, British racism and British icons. Now, I'm sure you would have seen the topic that was circulated together with the £10 notes. Elder Cecil will explain the significance of that. So now I'd just like to pass over to Elder Cecil. So Cecil, when you're ready.
Yep. Thank you, my brother Tahaka, and may I thank our brother Imani for that moving and important ceremony. My topic, as you have announced, you certainly put it out there in Media Land, is British racism and British icons. Number one, the case of the lady novelist. Her name is Jane Austen, and she's on the UK £10 note. I had prepared a PowerPoint which has pictures of all these things, but sadly I didn't seem able to organize to get it to you, my brother, so that you could so that you could project.
I can most likely I can put up the £10 note anyway. I can get that.
Yes.
You can see that.
All right.
Carry on, and then I'll do that.
She's been there since apparently 2016, and another icon who's up there is Sir Winston Churchill, and people think of him as a great war leader. I have my doubts about that. The Germans would have had to try very hard, and they did, to win against the forces that were mobilized against them, which was the entire British Empire, the United States of America, then as now the leading industrial power in the world, and of course the Soviet Union. And that combination of forces, remarkable though German technology, German will and organization are, were really never going to win against that combination. And if we look back at Sir Winston Churchill, he made massive errors and mistakes in during the war, but as I say, he was always going to win. It might have taken 10 rather than 5 years, but that combination of forces was never going to lose to Germany. But that's not the real problem with Sir Winston. The real problem is his racism. And he was racist in relation to, and we're going to come back to this. I'm going to do a presentation about him on one of these first Sundays. If we look back at his, the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is a big fan of Winston Churchill. And I'm not sure if he's aware or if he's aware that he cares of quite how racist Winston Churchill was. But if you read his comments, starting with the Black Cubans in the Spanish-American War towards the end of the 19th century, if you look at his comments on Africans in Kenya, if you look at his comments on first Gandhi and then all of the Indian nation, if you look at his comments on Africa as it came towards independence, if you look at his responses to Black nurses treating him in his last big illness and maybe in other of his illnesses, you will find that this is a remarkably racist fellow. And so it's interesting that he is this big icon. And as I say, I'm going to provide some of the details in support of the claim that neither as war leader nor for anything else is he in fact properly an icon. Though, of course, he's actually properly an icon of the British because they are a remarkable people. We're in a moment when, having in desperation throughout the 60s and into the early 70s, made 3 applications to join the European Economic Community. They finally joined. They gained benefits from it of a significant kind. And while they were in it, they kept telling their people lies about how much harm it was doing to Britain and so on. And then a prime minister of theirs made the mistake of calling a referendum which released all the demons of the right-wing anti-marketeers. And of course, the mass of the British people, especially poor people, who'd been told repeatedly how much harm the EU was doing to them, voted to leave. And right now, the British, having not only willingly entered, but willingly, towards the end of its recent negotiations, made promises that were supposed to be watertight. They're now determined to go back on them and are in fact determined to going back on them. The French call the British perfidious Albion, which means effectively lying Britain. And that is indeed a truth. So these icons, in respect of whom we were frequently educated. I was born in Jamaica in the 2 decades before our independence, which means I'm a child of British late colonialism. And so I got the kind of education that they hand out to intellectually minimally competent people, both on the edges of the empire in places like Jamaica and here in the UK. And what you get taught is a series of things about a whole set of people, things that in the beginning you might not be equipped to question. For example, we got a lot of Shakespeare, and I ended up loving Shakespeare. It didn't take a lot to love Shakespeare, but looking back and looking into Shakespeare subsequently, I find that there's a big issue about the amount of racism, anti-African, anti-Jewish in his work. And whether you're in the presence there of a man who is a racist or just understands how racism works and is depicting it cleverly and effectively, is the issue that one faces with Shakespeare. But many of the best of their literary icons were and are massive racists, and you get it, you know, recently Larkin, recently T.S. Eliot, and in the third quarter of the 19th century, during the that famous revolt in Jamaica called the Morant Bay Revolt, that the aftermath of that exposed the terrible level of racism that British liberal literary intellectuals practiced and were committed to, came as second nature to them. So there will be people out there who, in these circumstances, might wonder, what is Gutzmore doing trying to get us to think and talk about Jane Austen? This is a novelist who was born in 1775 and died in 1817. This was at the height of Britain's commitment to and participation in, as leader in the system that enslaved many, many, many millions of Africans in the Atlantic world and beyond, indeed. So, and it matters that that is her period, because a big issue arises as to her attitude to enslavement, her connections to it, and so on. So that's what I'm going to talk about, because, as I say, she is an icon of British liberal culture. She's famous, and she's been becoming increasingly famous. The Scottish big-time 19th century writer, Sir Walter Scott, was the first big name to discover that her writing had really fine qualities, and it does. She's a very, very good writer. I like her work as her work, as novels. In my long ago teens and even into my 20s, I did Inglit at O levels and A levels. I even got a scholarship level. No longer makes any sense, but I did get it back in the day. So I actually love English literature. Of course, since then, one has discovered African literature and one has discovered Caribbean literature, and both of those represent magnificent literary sites. So one doesn't have to be confined to one's first love. But I do love Jane Austen. And while I was doing her work, they gave us a novel of hers called Mansfield Park to study. It's a fine novel. It's not as easy a read as some of her others. She's famous for social comedy, but it's deep. It's not surface social comedy. It's deep social comedy. And it's not actually like many of her other novels. In fact, she only wrote 6 of them. They can be found in various formats. This one, for example, is Jane Austen. The novels are all there, and they come in hardback formats like that. The most complete collection was edited, comes out of Oxford University a few decades ago, and a first edition of it runs to several £100 of the 6 novels. So now, so Walter Scott discovered the quality of her writing in the early 19th century, when she was living at a peak of her powers. And since then, her fame and acknowledgement of her skills as a novelist have grown exponentially. I have somewhere in my library a book called How Jane Austen Conquered the World. And the author of that book really tells the story of how her fame and acknowledged skills as novelist and moralist grew to its current scale and shape. And if you're even vaguely interested in period drama and costume drama, you're bound to have seen at least one Jane Austen novel done up for TV or for film. Now, so I say, I did, in the way that we say, Mansfield Park, because that was what was on the syllabus when I was doing A-levels, I believe. And I could not help noticing that the particular story, it's a novel which, in Jane Austen's words, is a novel of ordination. A principal character in it is destined for the priesthood of the Anglican Church and is a very upright fellow indeed. And he belongs to the family. He's the second son of the family that are at the center of the novel. They're called the Bertrams. And I couldn't help noticed at once, I don't suppose I'm alone in having noticed it, that this Austen novel and at least one other have direct connection to the system of enslavement of Africans. Now, specifically this one, the Bertram's family live in Northamptonshire. The head of the family is an MP, Sir Thomas Bertram. As the novel opens, he has a townhouse, and family spends part of the time in London, and the rest of the time on their stately-ish home in Northamptonshire. Now, so he has a country estate, and that's one source of his income. But he's also an absentee owner of one or more slave-worked estates, sugar estates in the Caribbean island of Antigua. And it struck me as odd the way in which Jane Austen treats that matter. I repeat, the family is economically fundamentally dependent on income from this estate. And somewhere in the novel, it is said that things are not going well because returns from the estate are falling. And that plays a crucial part in the story that's told in the novel. Now, there is an economic crisis happening within the family, within the novel. One of the sources of the crisis is precisely that sugar estate back in the Caribbean. Returns are falling. So Thomas goes off to sort out this estate or these estates in Antigua. The other source, economic source of the crisis, is that the first son of the family, Tom Bertram, is living above his means. He gambles. He is fooling around with the richer young men than him, and is in economic trouble, and is placing the family in economic trouble because the father has to bail him out at a level beyond which he can afford. So he's not. He doesn't model, the son doesn't model proper economic behavior, living within your means. It's almost a moral category. And so the father has to address this double crisis. And one of the ways in which he seeks to do it is not just himself to go off to Antigua to sort out the estate or estates, but he takes this not quite reprobate, but misbehaving son with him, in the hope that taking him to a slave plantation island, watching him, the father, the head of the family, sort out the economics of the family, will bring him to his moral senses. And sense in Jane Austen's work is a moral category also. Other categories in it that are moral include property, include marriage, include propriety, decent, proper behavior. And a lot of that behavior is sociosexual conduct between men and women, proper conduct. Now, I need to take a step back, because the story at an important level is both the story of Tom Bertram, Sir Thomas Bertram's family, but it's also the story of his wife's family, because it opens, the novel does, with three sisters, modestly off in economic terms, and it's about how they marry and to whom they marry and their fate as a result of these three marriages. So Sir Thomas Bertram's wife marries well, and she is the lady of Mansfield Park, and the quiet, unconcerned wife, Lady Bertram, within the novel. The two other sisters, one marries somebody called Mr. Norris, who is a vicar, and he is the vicar in the living, and the living here is a Church of England notion where there's a parish, there's one or more churches, and there's some land and income, and some of the income may in fact come from the surrounding estate, because those livings are frequently attached to actual estates. This is what is the case here. And so the sister of the wife is being helped by her husband, who gives to Mr. Norris, who is not a wastrel, he eats too much and so on, but he is a distinguished fellow and worthy of the position that he is given by his brother-in-law. So one sister married to Sir Thomas Bertram, the next sister helped to a modest living as the wife of a vicar, an Anglican vicar, to whom Sir Thomas ascribes, or gives, if you will, a living on his estate. The third sister marries badly. She marries a naval officer who has no money, who has no very high standard of education, has next to no achievement to his credit, and they proceed to have what Jamaicans would call nuff picnic, whole heap of children, a lot of children. So very early in the novel, the third sister, the one who's married carelessly, Jane Austen says almost out of spite for her close relatives, is in trouble. Not much income coming into the family. The husband's a bit of a wastrel, but he doesn't have much income to waste anyway, so they're in trouble. And the sister-in-law, the third sister, the sister of the wife of Sir Thomas Bertram, actually writes seeking help. And the help that she writes to seek, it's important that we understand her letter, because it says a lot about Jane Austen's approach to her world and how well she understands and accepts indeed the world that she's living in. So the letter gets written, and what it's doing is asking Sir Thomas Bertram to help one of the sons of this wastrel, the sister who's married the wastrel naval officer. And she tells her brother-in-law and indeed all the members of the family, because the letter is read publicly, as it were, within the household, that this is a fine, upstanding 10-year-old, ready to go out into the world, ready to do anything. And please note that she says, can Sir Thomas help? Can he possibly offer this young man a place on his West Indian estate? 1. 2, can he find him a place in the Navy, which at the time was the principal instrument by which Britain held together a gigantic empire, one of the biggest empires that the world had ever seen, or at least at the time on well advanced towards being that biggest empire of all time. And the third area, she says, maybe he can be placed in India. So here is a member of the family writing to the head of the family, seeking help. And the help specifically shows acceptance of the various elements of British racist imperialism. This is some decades after Britain has taken control of India. And the benefits to Britain of taking control of India cannot be exaggerated. They're only less than the economic control that it still has of African resources. We leave that to one side. But importantly, India matters. And the sister and Jane Austen understand perfectly the importance of India, and that poor white English people have a possibility of bettering themselves or being bettered by going there. Then there is the Navy. And in fact, the boy gets placed in the Navy, and we will come back to that. And the third possibility, repeat, is to go and participate in running slave estates in the Caribbean, which doesn't happen, not because the slave estate is given up, it is no such thing is done. So here we have a novel which is supposed to be Jane Austen's morally most significant work. It's a work about ordination. She herself says so. And yet, when we look at it, or when I look at it, I find that there are two unconnected modes or forms or levels of morality, of ethics operating within it. No ethical issues of any significance, as far as I can see, are raised in relation to the fundamental ethical issue that presents to the novel, to this absentee slave owner family, and to the Britain of then as now. Can a civilized order depend upon slavery? That is the question. And is a person who is living off slavery capable of passing himself or herself off as a moral, ethically living, validly ethically living person? That's the big question that confronted 17th, 18th, and early 19th century Britain. And that is the core question arising within this novel. The family, the Bertrams, pass themselves off as moral entities, and yet their economic existence fundamentally depends upon returns that are temporarily challenged from slave estates in our region of the world, my former region of the world, the Caribbean. I'm still a Caribbean man, so I leave the business of former aside. Now, the second level of, and I repeat, that level of morality, the ethics of the invalidity, the non-ethical nature of economic dependency upon enslavement, is not addressed, in my view, in the novel. The second level of and form of ethics and morality exclusively revolve around issues of socio-sexual conduct, issue of correct approaches to property, and the connection between property and propriety has been stressed in at least part of the literature on Jane Austen. It matters that her novels, I repeat, are social comedies, but I repeat also deep social comedy. And the big issues at the center of the comedy relate to property, to marriage, to the relationship between men and women as marriage partners, and men too as appropriate marriage partners, and proper conduct, what a young woman cannot properly do in her social existence in relation to a man, in relation to a property, and so on. It is entirely at that level that a novel in which the lifestyle, the allegedly moral existence of the family is entirely dependent on enslavement. Austen concentrates her morality, her ethics, at the level of property-related socio-sexual propriety. And this always worried me. As long ago as the 1970s, by which time I left A-levels behind, left English behind, and had indeed gone into to social life and social activism. And I actually was invited by our late sister Dorothy Kuya to Liverpool to talk. And I went and talked in L8 about this novel and the problems that it presents and the extent to which those problems get ignored. Now, there is a vast literature on what might be called Austen's corpus, her body of work. And a lot of that literature focuses on this novel, which is problematic. The problems include the fact that it's not social comedy like at least 4 of the other novels, and that it's almost kind of uptight. It seems to exist in an area of Christianity that doesn't attract modern support and enthusiasm. So there are all these problems with it. But it is Jane Austen, and it is undoubtedly well written because all of her stuff is well written. So people have not failed to notice things about her. And she is written about by many people. Amongst those who have written on her, who in some way connect with us Black people, us African people, is Edward Said, the Palestinian intellectual, the Palestinian critic and political activist. And he deals with her work, with Austen's work, primarily in a book of his called Cultural Imperialism. But other people, many others, only some of whom I'm going to name, deal with her. One is Selma James. She has a little book here called The Ladies and the Mammies, Jane Austen and Jean Rhys. Selma James, have it in my hand. And in there is an essay on Jane Austen. It's learned, it's amusing, it's insightful, but for me, there's at least one problem. Jane Austen had a sister. She was very fond of the sister. Sister was the person to whom she was closest. that sister didn't marry because of the man she was, nor did Jane Austen marry. But the person to whom she was engaged went off to Haiti during the Napoleonic War, which happened also to be the time of the Haitian Revolution, which all listeners to these words should know lasted from 1791 to 1804, a 13-year-long war. Now, you could read, and I just double-checked, Selma's book and not understand that Austen's sister's betrothed, the man she was going to marry, was in Haiti as part of a British expeditionary force, the purpose of which was to take Haiti from the French Empire, put it into British hands, and continue slavery in Haiti. And the reason the man in question died of disease, a lot of white people in the tropics, as indeed did black people, but white people died disproportionately in the tropics until recently of tropical diseases. So that's how the man in question died. But he was there as part of the British Expeditionary Force, and it was a large force. And it's one of the large forces that the Haitian revolutionaries, the African Haitian revolutionaries, defeated. So if he hadn't died of disease, he may also have died from the military or in the military reversal that Britain undoubtedly suffered in Haiti. And I think it's slightly odd that Selma doesn't manage to make that point in speaking of where Jane Austen's sister's man, expected husband, died. Let us leave that to one side and look at what happens in response to this aspect. Enslavement as it appears in the novel and how it's treated in the novel, and in my view, the big problem that it is not actually addressed as the fundamental ethical issue that it is, that Austen stays located where morality and ethics are concerned in the field of socio-sexual morality and ethics, not the ethics of enslavement and dependency on it. Now, it's a complicated field, and there has been much angry and informative, and sometimes just angry and sometimes massively informative writing about this Jane Austen lady. I said that the enslavement issue is a problem. Sadly, her defenders take the view that so great a writer was she that her problematic engagement with enslavement doesn't really matter, and that in fact her art elevates her above any petty consideration of a thing like the presence of enslavement in her novels and the dependence of this family on it. Incidentally, members of her family had connections to enslavement, not just the brother who went off to fight in Haiti. Actually, he may have been a vicar who didn't go to fight. He was a sky pilot of, vicar in the army, if my memory is serving me right. Now, so sadly, both her most passionate defenders and the critics seem to end up agreeing to be defeated by the scope of her artistic achievement. So we have a writer, left-wing writer, Marxist writer, a man famously called Raymond Williams. And Raymond Williams, who I repeat, is a consciously Marxist literary critic and social critic, who's written importantly on the United Kingdom cultural development, cultural history, and so on. And what Raymond Williams, who's a critic, says, what happens in Emma, in Persuasion, and in Mansfield Park is the development of an everyday, uncompromising morality, which in the end is separable from its social basis. So it's a complicated way of saying that what Austen does is so good and so specific and so analytical in relation to its subject matter that the moral failure within it, the failure to address enslavement as the core ethical moral problem in the work, doesn't matter. And her work defeats other Marxist and neo-Marxist critics in exactly that way. Edward Said got around it by locating her as an advocate of imperialism, as somebody who was 100% accepting of the economic nature of the system in which she found herself, about which she wrote, about the system in which are ensconced families like the Bertrams and so on, dependent for their wealth on Britain's connection to enslavement in the Caribbean and Britain's connection to the conquest and exploitation of India. So Said locates her there, and he gets into trouble for it because there is in English literature and English criticism a set of manifestly terribly imperialist writers. The best and subtlest of them is somebody called Joseph Conrad, who wasn't even English, he was actually Polish, but wrote very well in his adopted language. And there is Kipling, who's the major celebrant of India, British India, but also of British imperialist conquest of Africa. Now, Austen isn't like them. She's not like them or like Rider Haggard. She is a very subtle acceptor of the frame and structure and processes of imperialism. And it's presented unproblematically rather than in, enthusiastic praise. But that kind of acceptance is only distinguished from the Rider Haggard kind or the Kipling's kind in degree. It remains in kind pro-imperialism. And Said, as I say, gets into trouble for making the point. But there can be no doubt about it. Any careful reading of Austen's work, what she does with silk, the fact that she talks about her little bit of ivory, which suggests that her work is actually confined domestically. Of course, it's not true. What she does in that letter near the start of Mansfield Park that I mentioned, but didn't read out, her embrace of the structure of imperialism is actually clearly there. And so Said is not at all wrong to make this connection between her and imperialism, even though it matters that she was not the kind of pro-imperialist writer that we get with Conrad, who also is complicated and subtle, or with Rider Haggard, or with Kipling, who also is complicated and subtle, but explicitly pro-imperialist. So, how is Austen's work to be managed in relation to enslavement? I say that she does not address the issue. And then, lo and behold, in about 2006, a woman academic called White, Gabrielle D.V. White, in a book which I think is called Jane Austen in the Context of Abolition, subtitle A Fling Against Slavery. My copy is buried somewhere at the moment, so I can't even wave it about, but I've read it very carefully indeed. And what the argument that White makes is, quote, I argue that amongst its other riches, Jane Austen's later fiction not only presupposes the British outlawing of its transatlantic slave trade, but also undermines the status quo of chattel slavery, the most extreme form of slavery. So, what M.S. White does is to say, all of you who are criticizing Jane Austen for her rendering of the issue of enslavement, and a man like you, Gutzmore, though she didn't know about me, just haven't read Austen subtly enough and not placed her properly within a key aspect of her context, which was the extended moment of Britain's abolition of enslavement. And it could be true because Austen was subtle, and she herself says, I do not write for such dull elves as have not a great deal of ingenuity themselves. So she expects her readers to be clever. And so clever do they have to be that unless you're sufficiently clever, you might miss her subtleties. And that is what Gabrielle D.V. White argues. She says that all you people who are criticizing her in relation to enslavement and dependence on it, especially in Mansfield Park, miss the point of that novel and the rest of her work. The point of it is that it's an abolitionist, emancipationist novel, and that has been missed. Now, how is White's argument to be treated? I actually don't accept it, but let me accept it provisionally and then tell you or suggest to you where acceptance of it leaves us. All who are listening and viewing should understand that Britain is a place that deals in national myths. It may be that all nations do that, and so that's not what I'm blaming them for. It's the nature of their national myths, the duplicity and wickedness of them, that is the issue I want to raise. Here is a nation that was the largest enslaver in the Atlantic world of Africans, and a mass murderer in the Atlantic world of Native Americans throughout big parts within the Americas. That connection to Atlantic enslavement continued from the time of the first Queen Elizabeth right through to the time of Queen Victoria, so over at least 300 years. And Britain profited massively. Now, what the British myth on this matter says is that, yes, it is true that that happened. You can't blame us because slavery and the slave trade were legal at the time. But as soon as we understood how wicked and evil it was, we, out of the goodness of our hearts, abolished it, right? So it has to be understood that that is the principle, or the first part of the principal deception that Britain engages in around abolition, its withdrawal from Atlantic enslavement. The second part is that if you believe that we did it out of the goodness of our hearts, that makes us a wonderfully moral nation. And that wonderful voluntary morality in which we surrendered real economic benefits in order to give up enslavement. And what is more, we engaged in the suppression, were principal actors in the suppression on the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, and in the Indian Ocean of the international trade in enslaved Africans. And that involvement and that voluntary surrender of economic benefit fits us, the British, more than any other people in the world to run the empire which we proceeded to set up and extend, and which, if you don't look very carefully at them, you will believe the third element of the thing, which is not just that there were moral people, hyper-moral, super-moral people running this empire, but that the empire itself was a moral enterprise. And that is only convincing if you swallow the myth of the benefits to the colonies of British rule. And let us leave aside the genocides that they conducted in taking over Rhodesia, in taking over Kenya, and so on. And everywhere else they took over was, and South Africa before that, although the Dutch were complicit in that, involved genocide, either protracted genocides or instantaneous, intense genocide. Let us leave those aside and walk with me to the Second World War. Everybody knows how outrageously Europeans, especially German Europeans, behaved in the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s in relation to racism against Africans, against Gypsies, and against Jews. And that everybody knows that Adolf Hitler dreamt up the idea that Germany could execute the final solution, and the final solution was nothing less than exterminating the Jews of Europe once and for all. Hitler said that it's true that there had been pogroms, that is to say, mass murders of Jews here and there throughout European history, but he wasn't going to bother with any small-scale pogrom. he was going to organize the total elimination of Jews, not just those in Germany, not just those in Austria, but everywhere they conquered in Europe. And they were going to transport them using wonderfully organized, well-organized German technology to gas chambers and kill them either in those or in forced labor camps all over the place. Now, at the end of the war, the British and the Americans and the French executed Germans who'd acted, by the way, perfectly legally. The system under which the mass extermination of Jews and Gypsies and Africans took place was legal within Germany. So the Germans could have argued that what they were doing was legal, leave us alone, post haste. Nobody took that seriously. And that has major implications for the British and the French and the Dutch now relying on the claim, which is false, incidentally, that enslavement when they were doing it was legal. Let them go and find you a statute on, law on the British statute book passed by Parliament, legalizing enslavement between the time of the first Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria when it ended. Let them go and find you one. Go and look at the end of enslavement in the British Empire and see if in that Abolition Act of 1833 you see a single law being abolished that legalized slavery. The way they did it was that they converted Africans into property and handled it under property law and handled it under insurance law. And then the illegalities that around slave laws and slave punishment and so on that happened in the colonies were allowed to colonial legislatures, and British governors then sent those acts not to Parliament but to the Privy Council for ratification. That was the process. That doesn't make legality, and if it makes legality, it makes the most bogus legality. Let us move on from that, because what we're dealing with is whether, as Gabriel D.V. White seeks to do, that if you accept that Jane Austen was an abolitionist, that excuses her involvement in and with enslavement at the family level and at the artistic level, and her failure to engage in her art, that is to say, in the novels, and especially in Mansfield Park, with the issue of the ethics of dependence on, economic dependence on enslavement. So, White is trying a thing, again, as we say in Jamaica. The thing she's trying is that she wants us to accept that abolitionism, British abolitionism, was a moral enterprise through which, indeed, the moral enterprise through which British enslavement was abolished. Now, all of us have read Eric Williams and C.L.R. James and Richard Hart and a whole ton of other Caribbean and other from Africa, a brother called Inikori, and many others, who make it clear that we don't have to write off white abolitionism. We have to put inside of the picture of abolitionism Black civil society abolitionists. And we have to have a whole space, and it's a massive space, for militant, indeed armed, revolutionary Black abolitionism, which is what the Haitian Revolution was, which is what revolts in the early 19th century in Barbados in 1816, in Guyana, Berbice a few years later, and if you go back into the history, massive revolt in more than one, in Guyana, enough revolts in Jamaica. That region, a key region of enslavement within, particularly the 18th century, was characterized by slave revolts. So, indeed, Richard Hart has a book in which he's entitled "The Slaves Who Abolished Slavery," and there's a big truth there. And Williams took that point up from James and expands it in relation to parts of the British Empire, and especially the Caribbean part of British Empire. So the old story about the British white abolitionism driven by humanitarianism, whilst not wholly written off, Wilberforce really did exist, and all of those others did exist, but that's about a fifth of the story. A much bigger proportion is the resistance of the enslaved, including in Jamaica in 1831-32, the so-called Emancipation Revolt led by Sam Sharp. And so, but there's another dynamic to the end of enslavement in the British Empire story. Repeat, had they succeeded in getting hold of Haiti, Britain certainly would not have abolished enslavement when it did. They were beaten out of Haiti by the fighting Afrikans. And so, but we need to remember, and I mentioned him already, Eric Williams. Book is called Capitalism and Slavery. Everybody knows the title, or should. And what he argues in that is not just sets out the economic basis in real detailed empirical facts for how Britain was built on its involvement with the enslavement of our ancestors. But he makes the argument, it's a very powerful argument, not that when they were thinking about ending enslavement, that system was in decline. There were some elements of crisis to it, and that is well documented, but that is not what Williams argues. What he argues is that British enslavement died because it came into competition with the rising forces of capitalism, and that Williams documents really rather well. It's a very important argument. And it's important that the classes produced in British society, including people at the bottom of the society and the new middle class, were committed ideologically, and new churches too, were committed ideologically against enslavement, so that there was a layer of anti-slavery here that related to socio-economic developments within broader British capitalism. And that is the argument, enhanced a little bit, that Williams makes in Capitalism and Slavery, among several arguments. So, even if M.S. White was correct and Jane Austen was an abolitionist of the moral kind that Wilberforce used to be celebrated for, there's a sense in which it is neither here nor there, because abolition did not arise, and not just abolition, but emancipation. It's important to understand that Williams talks about a four-part process. There is amelioration, that is to say, improving the conditions on the slave ships and on the plantations. The second thing is abolition, where the trade, so-called, of Africans across the Atlantic, the merchandising of our ancestral human beings, that is what abolition is, and it took place in 1807, 1808. And then emancipation happens in the 1830s in Britain, and it happens elsewhere in Europe and America at different times in the 1840s, in the 1860s, and in the 1880s. So it's a protracted process. And the fourth element of it, where Britain is concerned, is what Williams calls the equalization of the sugar duties, in which Britain set out to deprive slave-based production of its market advantage. That's what the equalization of those duties. It wouldn't have been just sugar duties. That's what that applies to. That's what that relates to. So, even if Jane Austen was the kind of deep-dyed abolitionist that White says she is, on, to my mind, bogus arguments, it wouldn't matter as much as White claims that it does. Now, White proceeds on the basis of the text, and her big claim, I repeat, is that people like me don't read Austen carefully enough. Well, it's not true. And I want to draw Miss White's and your attention to something that happens in what literary people call the denouement, the final ending, if you will, the resolution, the moral, largely, resolution that happens at the end of works like novels, or used to. Now, remember what I say, that there are two planes or types of morality, of ethics, at work in the novel, and that Jane Austen concentrates entirely on the socio-sexual mode or type or level of morality and ignores the morality around the question of whether this family can be said to live in an ordained setting when it is economically dependent on returns from slave labor in Antigua, in our part of the world. Right. So the denouement. How does Austen resolve the moral problematic of the book? Here is the opening of the final chapter in Mansfield Park. Jane Austen speaking. She says, "Let other pens dwell on guilt and misery. I quit such odious subjects as soon as I can, impatient to restore everybody not greatly at fault themselves to tolerable comfort, and to have it done, and to have done with all the rest." Right? Now, this is a novel in which those at fault, in Austen's eyes, are the ones who commit socio-sexual indiscretion. They commit adultery, they behave badly and get punished by illness, etc., etc., etc. And they get punished. They don't get restored because they are beyond the moral pale. And the moral pale, the boundaries of it are set by issues of socio-sexual morality, conduct, propriety. Now, what about the others? All of these others, Sir Thomas, Fanny Price, who is the heroine of the novel, and the man she ends up marrying, her cousin Edmund Bertram, are all guilty of the offense of living off the immoral earnings of enslavement, right? Sir Thomas, who in this rendering by Austen herself, right, is not to be troubled by guilt. Of course, he's troubled by a little guilt. He's troubled by the fact that his daughters have committed socio-sexual improprieties. That troubles him. He's troubled by the fact that Mrs. Norris, his sister-in-law, didn't see those improprieties and do anything to solve them. He's troubled by that. He's troubled by the fact that, given that those daughters have gone in that direction, and that his son has also, in a way, gone in that direction by almost ruining the family half with gambling, they, Sir Thomas, Edmund, Fanny, and young Tom, are all set back in proper place within this ordained order. Not a word about their living off immoral earnings, not a word about that, because Austen and her defender, White, aren't really concerned with that, because White thinks that if you can rope somebody into the abolitionist kraal, they automatically become moral beings who are fit to run empires that are moral by virtue of the fact that these are the people, the moral people, running it. And there's a final argument, you know. So when it comes to the end, never mind which abolitionist books Jane Austen was reading. And that is documented in the novel. I had noticed them and I understood exactly what they were and are. So it's not a question of misreading. The point is that all of that abolitionist reading is undermined by Jane Austen's two things. One is the fact that she does not engage with this ethical problematic at all, dependence on immoral earnings. But Sir Thomas, who comes back from reorganizing the immorality of the estate in order to improve the returns from it so that they can live better, is the one who comes to clean up the socio-sexual mess that his errant daughter, sister-in-law, daughters, sister-in-law, and son have created. And he comes back like this big moral being from sorting out the economics of his slave estate in the Caribbean. What exactly does DVD White say about that? Nothing, as far as I know. She doesn't have any answer to that problem. And I end by saying that what us Africans and all interested need to understand about British abolitionism: first, it claimed too much for itself. Secondly, even if it had been, you know, humanitarian abolitionism led by white folk, had been the only factor in abolition and emancipation and that four-stage process, it would still not have provided Britain with the ethical basis on which it rests its claims about being a moral nation, fit on the basis of that morality to run an empire that is falsely claimed to have been a moral entity. Somebody, a white scholar, talks about that matter, and he renders it in this way, and I like the way he renders it, because what he says is that we have to understand the moral economy of British imperialism, British colonialism, the British nation. And the moral economy says, beyond a shadow of doubt, we are moral. This is repetition, but I'm putting it in this guy's words. The man is called Seymour Drescher, I repeat. That we are moral because we gave up slavery out of the goodness of our hearts once we discovered how wicked it was. Never mind that we didn't compensate the enslaved. Never mind that we tell lies about the legality of what was fundamentally illegal at the time, where you had to manipulate the structure of your state in order to cover the illegality of the system of enslavement, and the fact that juridically, or rather legislatively, it was not in fact legal. Nor was it legal morally and juridically either, because in the biggest juridical sense, nothing that happened in any parliament could have legitimated enslavement. So Britain then goes on to say, given that what we did between the 1770s and the 1830s or 40s, depends on how you read that four-stage process, that fitted us to be the most fundamentally moral, ethical people in the world, and entitled us in a way that nobody else was or is entitled to run the greatest empire on which, as we all know, the sun never set. And it's an old joke, but the reason that the sun never set on it isn't because of its size, but actually because the Almighty couldn't trust them in the dark. The French discovered that about the British long time ago, and that is why they call them perfidious, lying Britain, perfidious Albion. Right now, in the international order, they have betrayed a clear commitment from which they benefited to being in the EU, and now, having gained the benefits, the only industry, including the banking sector, that's in Britain, is in Britain because Britain was in the EU, not because anything sensible or sane or beneficial to Britain, especially poor people in Britain, actually happens here. So that is what I have to say about Jane Austen, and especially about her novel Mansfield Park. It's my brother.
Okay, thank you, Elder Cecil. That was a very deep academic delivery. So I hope all the listeners are still with us, because I've noticed there's very few comments have been come. So this is the time. I think now you've had a bit of time to hear what Brother Elder Cecil said. And especially towards the end, he did bring it right up to date by mentioning what Britain is doing in the EU and in terms of the banking system here. So this is your chance to put any questions forward or any comments that you'd like to make about it. And while I'm waiting, I think I will start off. I'll jot down a few questions here while you was going along.
Yes, my brother, I'll try to answer any questions that you have. I know they'll be deep and problematic.
Okay, the first point was, as you say, the family owned the sugar estate in Antigua.
Yes.
So they was benefiting directly from slavery.
Yes.
Which at the same time, it seems to me, they were pretending to be ultra moral.
Yes.
In the way they conducted themselves.
Yes.
So it's like
yes, absolutely, yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So is that the case? Within British society at the time, they were holding themselves up as this holier than thou family, where in the back somewhere, unbeknown to many people, they were directly engaged in slavery in Antigua by enslaving people who was then producing sugar, which then went on to produce the finances to run their estate. Would I be right in saying that?
Yes, you would be. And I know what I said might sound academic, but it's very simple. There are two moralities built into the novel. The author is silent about one, and the other one is the basis on which the novel is run. Good socio-sexual conduct, behaving yourself, marrying right, not violating the norms of behavior in terms of, for example, kissing a boy before you get engaged and all of that proper chaperoning and staying in until you finally come out as a young woman and so on. All of that is at the heart of the novel. Good conduct, propriety related to property. And on that level, the novel is fine, excepting that the author is completely silent about the dependence of this morally, allegedly, socially, morally excellent family that they're, as I put it, living off immoral earnings. And that's the key ethical and moral issue in the novel, and it's unaddressed. And it's unaddressed even at the end, where the author says, I'm going to put everybody who's not an offender back into their proper place and in proper order. And no point is taken against Sir Thomas, who's just been off in the Caribbean, sorting out the sugar estate so that the returns can balance up again, and so on. Only the people who have committed socio-sexual immoralities get any blame attached. And that being so, it's very difficult to see how White, in this clever book, can try to excuse Jane Austen by saying, wow, she was an abolitionist. And that's all we need to know.
Okay. Now, the other point you touched upon was Winston Churchill. And you... Now, so the other point you touched upon during your presentation was Churchill.
Yes.
Yep.
I'm going to come back to Churchill, you know. I'm going to do a presentation on him, perhaps next time we're together or the time after that. It's very important that people know that he wasn't a great war leader. The British Empire, the American Empire, and Russia could not have lost against Germany. Even if it took them 10 years, they would have won. The resources were entirely on their side. Germany might have got the atom bomb because, you know, they had some very clever people and very clever technology. But unless something like that happened, they didn't have the manpower and they didn't have the resources to win that war. And Hitler made big strategic mistakes. Churchill also made big strategic mistakes, but because of the scale of resources that was on his side, they always came back. Now, his racism is what is the second thing that I will want to concentrate on, and how racist he was in his remarks and actions in relation to Africans in the Americas, Africans on the continent, and to Indians in India. This is documented. You don't have to invent it.
Yeah, I think Elder Peppercar is here, but you need to put your lights on. We can hardly see you. I never realized you was there. So like a shadow in the dark. Yeah, and yeah, that's fascinating. The other point that you brought up is the name of Edward Said.
Yes.
Now, as you said, Said, in his roundabout ways, tried to cleverly criticize Jane Austen in terms of her attitude towards slavery, but he said he got into trouble for that. Could you just expand on that a bit?
Okay. as I think I said, but it's easy to miss. There's a big literature on Jane Austen. She has fans, decent people, white people, black people. I like her work, right? This is how I come to know about it, because I actually fell in love with the novel and her writing, despite this big problem that's inside of it. And I've stayed with the problem and also stayed with understanding that she's a significant novelist. So Said is a very, very fine, people should know his work, Palestinian writer. And his Culture and Imperialism has almost a full chapter in which he discusses Jane Austen. And at the point at which he says she is an imperialist writer, whole heap of people jump down his throat, because they don't want that to be said, because they see imperialist writers as being people like perhaps Conrad, like perhaps Kipling, like perhaps J. Rider Haggard, and she's not like them. So what does he mean? And the evidence of what he means is very, very clearly in the text. She is comfortable with receiving the benefits of this racist imperialist setup. India, slavery in the Caribbean, the navy that holds it all together. The brother of the heroine of the novel, whose mother writes to Sir Thomas asking for help, he finds the boy a place in the navy, and he ends up rising within the navy. And one of the things that the navy is doing at the time is suppressing slavery, because Britain, having got out of it, doesn't want anybody else to continue it and benefit from it, in an ongoing way. So they participate in an official anti-slavery patrol. I repeat, in the Mediterranean, where they were stopping some people called the Barbary people, in the Mediterranean, in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, and in the Indian Ocean, where they came down on the Arabs who were still trading enslaved Africans into Arabia and Mesopotamia. So Said doesn't make the connection that I make, to do that focuses on what abolitionism really is. And I don't even know that he engaged with Miss White's book at all. So his stuff stands there. It's good and well worth reading, because he's a subtle man, very, very bright, able guy. Said, he died of cancer a few years ago, but she defeats all of the left-wingers because they can't get round the quality of her writing. And they say that, in effect, nobody that good can be as bad as we are saying that she is. And the art overcomes class consideration. Yeah.
Okay. Just before bringing Elder Pepperkai, the other point is, staying on the slavery point.
Yes.
Now, Britain, as you said, considered itself on the moral high ground for the simple reason it said that it voluntarily got out of the slave trade. It saw the evils of it, saw that, realized it was wrong, and then got out of it. Do you buy that argument?
No, I don't buy that argument, and I hope that you and the listeners and viewers understand why I don't buy the argument. What I say about that argument is that Eric Williams and C.L.R. James in the 1930s dealt with that argument. Williams came into Britain at a time when British abolitionism was celebrated. People were almost worshipping Wilberforce, right? And Williams set about in Capitalism and Slavery to say, we don't have to completely write off these people, but we got to see that they have feet, the abolitionists, we got to see that they have feet of clay, and then we have to look for the other factors. And the other major factors were the fact that the enslaved fought against enslavement to the extent that it can be said by a serious writer that the enslaved abolished, the people who abolished slavery, one, and that the economic factor, and there were many, but fundamentally the most important one was a rising pattern of capitalism within Britain itself. The industrial revolution that had benefited from Britain's connection with enslavement was making Britain into the kind of economy that wanted to embrace and did embrace free trade rather than slavery and other kinds of forced labor, although it used other forms of forced labor for a long time afterwards. So the key book that answers the claim that Britain was running morally qualified to run a moral empire is taken apart by Eric Williams, as long ago as 1945, when he did a thesis at Oxford, which he spent the next few years building up into what became the Capitalism and Slavery, and that all of those arguments are in that book.
Okay, there's a point here. Let me see what it is. Okay, they're saying there's a documentary evidence confirming that another real reason for the British abolition and naval action was to prevent others from benefiting from the continuation of the slave trade. I think you more or less said that.
Yes, I've touched on that. They make a lot. They make a lot of their participation in the anti-slavery patrols in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, what they were doing was sabotaging the Arabs because they wanted to do other stuff in that part of the world, and enslavement got in the way. The same thing applied in West Africa. One of their big leaders talked about the need for what he called legitimate trade with West Africans instead of the illegitimate trade in Africans, if you will. And the economics of that state of affairs is crystal clear. And the British interest in suppressing enslavement was there. The other point to make is that it wasn't all that effective, Brazil and America imported a whole heap of Africans at the time when Britain prides itself on suppressing on suppressing the Atlantic trade in Africans. So let them run up their mouth about the anti-slavery patrols, the British Navy. It was ineffective.
Yeah, at this point, Elder Pepperkai. Yeah, you would have to mute your mic. Yeah.
Yeah, greetings, brothers.
Greetings, my brother.
Greetings.
I didn't plan to engage in the broadcast. I was listening in.
Yes.
Because I've never read any of Jane Austen. I know her to be a canon of British literature, one of the big canons. But my argument is very simple. That what Brother Cecil has done, and rightfully so, to expose the hypocrisy in this whole nonsense of being moral and just and all that foolishness.
Yes.
Because when Britain currently talks about their values, I ask the question, what value? Value in thieving, value in deception, value in all the criminality that they carried out. Because, as Brother Cecil said, there's no law that says slavery was justified. Their argument is that It was legal at the time. Never legal. How can it be when it's such a monstrosity and dehumanizing a murderous onslaught upon the people?
Yes.
So when they talk about morality and our values, and British society, what the hell they're talking about? And our response have been too puny in dealing with this, because one thing we must understand that racism is a savage culture, nothing else. Very savage, very brutal, very inhumane. So we can't ramp and play with it with all the niceties, because when a sister said she's a great novelist and there's some merit to what she described in British society about morality and so on, I would have to have some magnifying glass to see it. Because even the marriage, they married because they love each other. They married because it's a hustle.
Yes, property.
I would link myself to it. So I would have a big problem with it, and to be quite honest, I wouldn't want to waste too much time on it. But the sense is quite right to expose it, because people see her as one of this great canon of British literature, and it's mandatory reading in curriculums and so on and so forth. I'll stick to mine, Google what the uncle, Chinya Chebe, which are my king-read literature giants, and I benefit greatly from them, and I don't have to go elsewhere. Quite comfortable, happy with those.
Okay.
Thanks for that. Let me just say one or two things. Remember, I'm sort of slightly older than Brother Pepperkai, but we were all dragged up on.
So while you're answering that, the brother came back, the person saying, but I think you did answer it. It's clarification.
Okay, no, I want to deal. I want to deal with that. I want to deal with that.
Okay.
I want to deal with that. I recommend, and it matters, that the sister who is asking for clarification and citation, let the sister go and read Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, right? It's out there. It's available. It came out in 1945, but it's been reprinted enough time. It's not an easy read, but it's a fundamental read. And there is a guy called Seymour Drescher, who's a very interesting white scholar. I actually vaguely know him. And his book is called Capitalism and Anti-Slavery. So between the two of them, you get the subtlety of not just how slavery made British capitalism, but also how British capitalism has made by slavery, then unmade enslavement. And you also get a sense of the various factors that went into the ending of British slavery. It's not humanitarianism, it's not emancipationism. It's slave resistance, it's economic development, and so on. And it's all set out in Capitalism and Slavery, my sister, and there's no shortcut. That's the stuff that you have to read. That's where the citations are. And there's one perhaps final thing that I want to say. I'd started to make the point that if we ignore, but we shouldn't, but recognize but move past the many mass killings that the British and the French and so on did at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. When you come to after the Second World War, when they had just hanged Germans for mass killings, and then go and look at what they did in Vietnam, in Kenya, in Algeria, in South Africa, in Mozambique, in mass killings, right? So they place themselves on this pedestal, and they put Germans into gas chambers, and then they proceed to carry out the most horrendous mass slaughter of people who are resisting them because we have a right to be free. That's what the war in Kenya was about. That's what the war in Algeria was about. That's what the Vietnam War is about. That's what the liberation struggles in Southern Africa is about. It's about the fact that even after the gas chambers, the Europeans tried to continue to carry on the world as it was before, with all of the racist genocides and so on, sometimes on a larger scale. More than 1 million Kenyans were put into concentration camps after the war. And more than 100,000, maybe even 1 million died.
Yeah, there's another point here. It says, why do we feel... Shall I read it out?
What, you read it for the listeners, yes, or viewers.
Okay. Why do you feel Britain and Europe places such importance on the moral high ground when the actions of both paint a very different picture? For example, the boatloads of people we see now coming across the channel, I would say.
Well, those boatloads arise also from their wickedness. All of the countries, but the African ones, they mashed up with neocolonialism, but Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan are all places that people are coming from that they wrecked for no good reason, right? Yeah. Now, the question of why they put so much emphasis on morality, all people at least try to operate in terms of systems of morality. The problem with Europe is that it has to be bogus because their reality is not connected with morality at all. It's actually connected with ruthlessly, murderously pursued interest. And so their morality is never genuine. It's always instrumentalist.
That's true. Yeah. There was another point here. Let's see if I can find it now. Yeah, when they talked about Haiti, the fact that Austen's one of her sisters was
her sisters. Yeah, her sister was about to marry.
Husband or something. Went off to Haiti, and the intention was for Britain to seize Haiti and continued slavery.
Yes, they tried. They put a gigantic. We talk about, and this is what we don't necessarily know. But we talk about the Haitians defeating the Spaniards, the British, the French. The French put in at least 2 big armies, and so on. That they actually defeated a gigantic British army. The British put into Haiti during the revolution a gigantic force trying A, to defeat the enslaved, and B, to take the island from the French. And if they had succeeded, they would never have abolished enslavement when they did. Because at the time, Haiti represented the basis of the French challenge to British mastery of the system of Atlantic enslavement. On the basis of Haiti, France was becoming a more important player in that game than the British. And what the British did when the Africans started the war was to try to go in, defeat the Africans, and take the island. It was their second attempt. They in 1655 they had tried and failed. That's when they took Jamaica instead.
Any other points, Elder Pepekai, while we're...
Yes, I just want to make a small point. When Cecil said that these boatloads of Africans and other oppressed people fleeing their home countries to come to Europe is because of what Britain and other European countries does for no good reason. Yes. I want to say this point for no good reason. There was never any good reason for the intervention and for the invasion and the brutality.
No, so, I agree with what you... Oh, sorry, go on.
I'm not saying that you said...
Yeah.
This is our general audience, that there was never, ever any good reason.
No.
Yeah.
Every one of the places that they've wrecked in recent times, Afghanistan What were they doing in Afghanistan? The people who did 9/11 came from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were their friends, so they gave them a blight and went and mashed up Afghanistan. Iraq, everybody knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction there. And yet they fought 2 wars there. The second war was only fought because they said that the first one wasn't complete. and the first one was on the basis of lies. What's the place name? Syria. Syria has been wrecked for no other and better reason than it has a leader who is not kowtowing to them. And so they set out to break it up and to destroy him. He has allies with the Russians, and so even though every time the forces that are operating against them are defeated, the West simply resupplies them in exactly the way that they used to do in Angola with Savimbi, right? It's the same kind of thing. They have a wrecking ball on the place. They want a piece of it for Israel. Israel has already annexed the Golan Heights, and they want Turkey to have a bit, and so on and so forth. That's what that's about. Nothing legitimate.
Okay, there's another question
but
here.
One last thing though. One last thing though. On some of the people who are coming are African, and that distresses me greatly because I live in Europe and I know the condition that Africans are seeking to come to. I know what they do when they come here, and it strikes me that self-respecting continental Africans should be spending more time trying to bring about the revolution in Africa, to get the white people out of control of our economies and so on, to get the neocolonial leaders off our backs and so on. That's what we need to be doing, not dying in droves, getting across the Sahara, and dying in droves, getting across the the Mediterranean, and then dying in small numbers, getting across the English Channel. For what? I don't understand. So I can't pretend to be 100% sympathetic. When I see those Africans, it pains me because they're doing the wrong thing.
Okay, there's a question here. And it said, do you think that the desire for the moral high ground could provide leverage for reparations for African slavery?
No. You have to remember that these whites who have constant recourse to morality are not really moral people. And so their morality, to repeat what I just said, is bogus. So where reparations are concerned, there are 2 things. One is power, and the other one is morality. They don't have any morality, although they keep talking about it. And they have the power, and we're not without power, you know, but we have to unite and liberate ourselves before we can get back the power and conscientize ourselves, as Garvey argued all 100 and so years ago. In the absence of that, but nothing is happening in the white world that will give them a sufficient level of morality to lead them to compensate Africans for what they're still doing to us. They're taking now, in economic terms, more than they've ever taken. Look at what is happening with African resources and the fact that they're all owned in the city of London and Paris and whatever. So there's no appeal to morality that can work. One final little point. Something is happening now that the state, the big institutions, are holding on to refusal on the basis of no morality, whilst some other institutions lower down are beginning to try to deceive us around reparations. So they have some universities and some other institutions that are saying, look, we're giving you reparations. And then when you look at what they're doing and analyze it properly, you see that that's just a low-level trick that they're trying to pull. And some of us are falling for it. For example, the CARICOM people, who should know better, appear to be falling for what the University of Glasgow did. And what they do, they said, we took 200 million from you. we done a count and that, so it could be 1,000 million. No. But let's accept their figure. We took 200 million for you. You should really get back not 200 million, but 20 million. And then they say, we're not even putting the full 20, right? So they're leaving 180 million right where it was. And then they're not even forking out the 20 million themselves. They're going to say, we're putting up the seed money or a few million, and then we're going to join with you in raising the rest from God knows where. And Beckles and the King falling for that. And some other people are too. So we, conscious Africans, have got to tell our fellow Africans that that soft power, pretend offer of reparations must be laughed out of court as soon as possible.
I just want to touch on the points of people getting onto lake and dying in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And I hope that Taka will look for some people to address this point at some point later down the road, because it is very serious, as Brother Cecil says. And it has many dimensions to it. Yes, there are young people who can't find an employment because even they are farming, you have cheap goods like onions and what have you flooding the market in Africa. And people can't grow the carrot and the thing to eat. And they're getting this stuff being dumped on them. The situation also that there are people in Africa itself who are in this bogus scheme that promising people jobs in Europe if they put up money, and they're paying some serious money. If they use those money to find ways, and the content itself, it'll be a sound investment. But they're not. They're paying for these scam, end up in Libya and such places where they've been brutalized, sold as slavery, and they're trying to escape those murderous conditions, find themselves dying. And also, those who on these leaky boats, the coast guards of Europe just turn their back and let them drown.
Yes, some of that, a lot of that is happening, yeah.
So we have to look at it, because you would think what happened in the transatlantic, we end up on these boats where we end up in slavery to make riches for Europe. The same thing is happening. In fact, more of us probably dying because we were valuable cargo at that time, and only the sick were thrown overboard, and the rebellious one were thrown overboard. Literally, a whole boatload is being murdered in the Mediterranean. So it's serious to look at it. I just want to touch.
I agree that should be looked at. Yep.
I just want to touch on another point Peter make when they mentioned the Saudis who was involved in 9/11. I didn't buy that for 1 minute, because when they look at the Twin Towers, I know they were brought down. I'm no architect, but those are controlled demolition. But putting that aside, there was a third building that not only collapsed, but even metal turned to liquid. And I'm glad that the families of the people, of some of the people, perished in that. I don't know what to describe it. How to describe it? That's savage, murderous act. They are mounting a campaign, so that's not finished yet, and we will get to the bottom of it. Who did it and why? And it has nothing to do with some people come out of some cave in Afghanistan or wherever.
Okay.
I agree with your last point. The stuff about the bringing down of the Twin Towers is a complicated complicated matter. There are lots of theories about it, some of which I'm suspicious of, but it's up for debate, and there's a whole heap of material out there about it for another day.
Yes, yes.
Okay, there's a point here. I don't know if you can see precisely what real or hard power do Afro-descendants have given our position and global population numbers vis-a-vis whites and the rest of the world.
Very briefly, those who hear me on this medium will the reference to hard power is a reference to European institutions, especially their states and banks and so on. We have people's power, and that's the power that we have. We Africans squandered the hard power that we should have built by uniting Africa in a different way, and setting up the institutions like the Chinese did and the Indians did, and so on. And because we failed to do that, that task is still ahead of us. So right now, Africans don't have any hard power.
We're not even soft power.
That's true.
Thank you,
No
Thank you,
power.
Power is in
Okay.
short supply amongst us.
All right.
I think it's important that we end now or soon.
Yeah,
Our
yeah,
brother
yeah,
was
yeah.
to do closing. Yeah.
Yeah, in the last 5 minutes, the last question. You mentioned somebody called Raymond Williams. He said was
Yes.
a social critic,
Yes.
and accused Jane Austen of racism.
No, no, he
well,
doesn't accuse her. Doesn't
Well, I
accuse her of
heard wrong
racism.
then. I heard
No,
wrong.
he's one. No, you can look him up. He's a big
Okay.
English social critic.
Mhm.
What I say about him is that the quality of Jane Austen's writing, he's one of the people who, despite being a left-winger, she defeats, because his approach to her in terms of class considerations wasn't up to the task of really understanding what she was at, either in race terms or even properly understood class terms. So he is one of the weak lefties that
Okay.
I end up dismissing when I'm thinking and talking about Jane Austen. No, he doesn't accuse her of racism.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I just misheard. Okay, I'm afraid time's beating us again. So I'd like to thank everybody that's tuned in today. And I'm sure now you can go away and say you know a bit about Jane Austen, for those who didn't study her at school. But this is important because a lot of the information are buried in these novels. Because they're novels, people don't think of consulting them in terms of historical perspective, because they're written in a novel. But in fact, probably more information, more relevant information is buried in novels than we realize. You know.
True.
So in ending this session, first I'd just like to thank Brother Elder Cecil again for tremendous presentation. Every time he gives a presentation, I can see it by the responses. People are eager because they learn so much.
Absolutely.
From a master teacher that he is, And again, Elder Pepperkai, thank him again for his contribution. And just to say, Elder Pepperkai and Brother Cecil sitting there are two of the founder members of the Pan-African Congress Movement, the organizations whose platform this is. And myself and Brother Imani are very grateful for the work that they did, in putting together such a body that we could come along later and just slot into it. But
absolutely,
I can say the PACM, that's it. And PACM's here, has been around since 1975 and intend to be around for many, many more years to come. So this is our actual, you can say this is our window to the world, because we know on this platform we are being heard truly globally, right throughout the Pan-African world. People are tuning in. Even if they can't hear us live, these lectures, these presentations are left up on the platform, which is visited frequently by brothers and sisters throughout the Pan-African world. And I know they're of great benefit to them from the comments that we have been getting. So, in our time-honored way, we like to end this presentation by our Ox Ndugu Imani to do the honors of doing this libation to end this session today.
Okay, Asante Sana. And again, Asante Sana to the Wazir, the Cecil, and Pepper Kai. And it's beautiful to have such wisdom and knowledge, and it's a benefit to all of us, and as Ndugu Tahaka eloquently said and explained. So I'll now bring our session to the end. We called the powers and the principles of the cosmos that are not only underpinning all existence, but are within us as well. And the ancestors, we call them into this realm to assist us, to help us, to guide us, to inform us. And of course, we called as well Wote, the all that is within us, our everlasting and undeniable higher selves. So I'm going to share my screen, Ndugu, if you can put that up for me.
Sorry, I missed that. If it's to me.
Yeah. No, just
no,
it's just sharing the screen. Yeah.
Just sharing the screen, Elder. And so I'm now going to close the session and close the ritual by playing the triangle chime. And as we do this, if you wish to be involved, there's no coercion here, but if you wish to be involved, then please sit straight, back straight, so that your energy centers in your body are aligned, feet flat on the floor, hands on your hands on your thighs. You're sitting in a chair, close your eyes. I'm going to play the chime 9 times. 9 because that's for healing and understanding. And the information that we heard today in such in-depth analysis helps us to understand and heal and give us clear sight. It helps us to build our communities, our families, and our race. So as I do, please have in mind gratitude and thanks to the ancestors, to the cosmic forces, the principles and powers we called, and to the all. And after they go back to their realms, they can't stay here in the 3rd and 4th realm with us, but go back to the realms with our intentions and help us manifest our objectives. So allow the chime to go around you, through you, over you, so that we connect and we be one accord as we part company. 9 times. Roger. Mbili. Tatu. Nne. Tano. Sita. Saba. Nane. Cecil. And finally, we end on the words of power manifested to the affirmations and to power our will and our desires. Say it with me if you can, or just listen. Nguvu zote kwa watu wetu, na mapenzi ya wote ni mapenzi yetu. All power to our people. The will of the all is our will. Asante sana.
Okay, asante sana. So until next Sunday at 6 o'clock here on PACMTV, I bid everybody kwaheri.
Kwaherini.